I've worked in kitchens all my life. I was a porter straight out of high school, working the dishes at a small Italian restaurant. I made my way through culinary school, interning as a junior chef at a hotel grill in Minneapolis. Over time, I've worked pretty much every position there is in a kitchen. Expediter, saucier, sous chef. Hell, I had a short run as an executive chef at a hotel in downtown Milwaukee. In 2014, I got a job at a place called Charcutaria Nobre. It was a high-end Portuguese restaurant known for their amazing cured meats. I think they've been featured on one of those travel shows. You know, the one with the tall guy. I can never remember the name. Within a month, I was assigned to the butcher station. I worked almost exclusively with one of the most famous pieces of the restaurant, the presunto de Barrancos. We served this amazing dish with a queijo de serra crostini and a fig compote. Probably one of the best dishes I've worked with. Over time, I got good enough to work the station in my sleep. Dado, the executive chef, took notice. Within a couple of months, I was promoted to sous chef. As the second in command, I mainly organized the other stations and made sure all relevant information was relayed. But I always returned to the meat station. Cutting the presunto was, and always would be, my job. I was happy there. There is something amazing about doing something you're good at and seeing that labor put a smile on someone's face. Running a kitchen is an absolute pain in the ass most of the time. But Charcutaria Nobre was a home away from home. We were planning for a particularly busy night. Dado was running back and forth like a madman, blaring like a siren. One of our deliveries had been stuck in customs for 2 days, and our reserves were running out. Into that, a particular set of high-end clients who were expected to show up, and you got a recipe for disaster. I was doing inventory with the pastry chef when Dado came in and took me by the arm. He gave the pastry chef a look that she knew all too well. She promptly left the room. "Are you good?" Dado asked. "You good to work? What do you need?" "They called. They want to order, eh? Off menu. Special order." "All right. Is it a substitution or—" No, quiet. Another dish. They want to feel important. You got this." "Dado, I'm not sure." "You got this." He pressed a piece of paper to my chest and waited. I sighed and accepted it. He pulled me in for one of his trademark hugs, kissed my forehead, and patted my cheek. "I love you. Do great work." Most of their orders were from the menu, but there was a particular item that stood out to me. Arroz à bulhão pato, a style of Portuguese clam cooked with coriander, white wine, and drenched in garlic. It's an acquired taste, but to a particular palate, it can be divine. We had 4 orders and little time to make it happen. Dado was counting on me, so I got to work. It'd be done by the time they arrived. It took me a trip to the fish market and a call to a sommelier friend of mine, but I made it happen. Later that night, as the guests arrived, I had everything ready. The fish station helped me prepare everything, and I arranged the presentation myself. Before sending it out, Dado stopped to do quality control. He took one sip with his tasting spoon, frowned, and nodded. "Is perfect." He nodded. "Good. I love you." Having Dado say little or nothing was always the best outcome. It was when he had a lot to say that you were in trouble. Once our prestigious guests had finished their meal, I saw one of our servers come back to speak with Dado. I could hear him halfway across the kitchen, right past all the pots and pans. No, Dado said. "Not me. Don't care." He pointed at me from across the room. The server came over with a big smile on her face. "They want to see the chef," she said. And yes, They're big tippers. I washed my hands and slipped out of the kitchen, following the server to the reserved table. There were 4 guests in total, all with the same order. There were 2 men in their mid-50s, dressed in a kind of business casual. Between them was a woman in her mid-60s. She didn't seem to have any qualms about showing off her vast jewelry or her intricately detailed hair. Finally, there was a very old woman. She could easily have been in her 90s. Wispy white hair, carefully brushed and styled. She had these bright green eyes that almost shone. The moment I approached, she locked her eyes to mine. It felt like a lion staring me down, considering me for a meal. Then she smiled. Her gums were completely black, like she'd been chewing tar. Her teeth were bright white and impeccable, something I'd never seen in a woman her age. The party turned to me with an appreciative clap. The bejeweled woman offered me her hand, and I took it. "Thank you so much for your efforts," she smiled. "It is rare to be treated with such reverence." The 2 men agreed, nodding to each other. "Mama knows her cuisine," said one of them. "She says it's good?" "It's good," added the other. Finally, the eyes fell on the matriarch at the table. With one finger, she waved me over. As I approached, she painstakingly got up from her chair. The others were ready to step in, but she held up a hand. They stopped immediately. She reached out towards me, and I took her hand gently. She smiled at me with those death-black gums. "We will come back." A voice that carried decades of smoking, and although it was a promise, it felt more like a threat. They'd come back about once every 3 weeks the following months. Every time, their requests would get more peculiar or specific. Cozido à portuguesa, arroz de cabidela, salted codfish, deep-fried pork ears, cow stomach lining. Hell, once we were asked to serve roasted goat kid. It took me ages to get the sarabulho texture just right. Dado had other things to deal with and asked me to officially make them my table. I couldn't say no. Every time they came by, they'd tip me at least a day's salary. They'd rant and rave about the dishes, and the evening would always end the same way. A firm handshake by the women at the table and a thank you. I can't say I disliked it, but there was something about the oil-black gums of the old woman that gave me the creeps. It was turning into late autumn. Leaves had long since shifted color, and the trees were just a few weeks from dropping them completely. There was that musky smell of moist earth in the air, and people had brought out their winter gear. Dado had started to wear his handcrafted Italian fedora, which was the official signal that winter was just around the bend. I'd been prepping for days to get the next dish right. I'd never worked with lamprey before, and I can't say it was very pleasant. It's like the offspring of an eel and a garbage disposal wrapped in a rubber tube. But still, I did what had to be done. They want arroz de lamprey? They get it. Sauce, rice, and a fantastic red wine. That night I was out helping Dado bring in some boxes for the freezer. When we finished, we stayed on the loading dock to have a smoke. Dado usually offered me a cigarillo on calm nights, and this was looking to be one of them. "You know who they are?" he asked, nodding at the restaurant. "No idea," I admitted. "But with money like that, they don't need to say their names." "Machado," Dado nodded. "Big family. They run, copper mines." He finished his cigarillo and stomped it out. "Do not disappoint." "Never would. I know. I love you." I was a bit nervous about sending out my arroz de lamprey, but I think I nailed it. It's hard to tell if you've done something right when you haven't worked that ingredient before. But I trusted my team and palate, and Dado gave me the go-ahead. I kept my head down and worked the presunto in the meantime, hoping for the best. Not long after, like clockwork, the server came to fetch me. "You're up," she said. "They're eager." That time, as I approached, they all got up from their chairs. It startled me a little, which seemed to amuse them. When the old woman joined them, I got a short burst of applause. "Our saviour," smiled the woman in her 60s. "Magnificent," added one of the men. And finally, the old woman in the back took my hands, smiled at me with her death-black gums and said, "Join us, please." I looked back at Dado, who approved. I could use a break. The family officially introduced themselves as the Machados. The two men were Cristo and Cesar, sons of the woman in her 60s, Erica. She, in turn, was the daughter of the matriarch, Octavia. They poured me a glass of wine and congratulated me on another dish well served. I insisted that I couldn't take all the credit, but they wouldn't hear it. "Mama has worked in plenty of kitchens," said Cesar. "She knows a good job when she sees it." "A pro is a pro is a pro," emphasized Cristo. "You're an artist." Octavia, on the other hand, just stared at me. It felt like those green eyes would pierce right through me. She glanced back at Erica, who nodded in understanding. Octavia cleared her throat, and the table fell silent. "I'm getting, old," she said. "It takes time to get out like this. Can you cook for me?" Out of something resembling instinct, I said no. I didn't even consider it. The Machados were perfectly pleasant, but there was something about them that just didn't sit well with me. They were almost too pleasant. Then they explained. It would be a part-time thing, once a month. They would provide the recipe and ingredients, and I would have free rein in their vast kitchen to make it. One night a month, and they'd pay me the equivalent of an entire week. Tax-free, of course. Hush, hush. Octavia wouldn't take no for an answer. Erica and her sons insisted on how much they loved my work and how they wanted to introduce me to the rest of their family. They swore I would want for nothing, and that if I asked, they could open any number of doors to any number of restaurants, worldwide. I hadn't even noticed Dado approaching the table. At first I thought he'd give me crap for having a glass of wine. But no, he patted me on the back. "For esteemed guests, he has my blessing," Dado smiled. "He'll do great work." With that, I couldn't say no. Dado was invited to the table, and he stuck around to speak some Portuguese with Octavia. I knew a few words, but I was far from fluent. I just sat back and observed. Having known Dado for years, I could tell when something affected him, and there was something the old woman said that made him visibly nervous. Dado doesn't get nervous. Later that night, as we closed up, I asked him about it. At first he seemed reluctant to answer. He put on his hat, adjusted his coat, and took a deep huff off his cigarillo. It doesn't translate well," he said. "But that woman," he shook his head, "she's the fucking devil." From that point on, I spent every last Sunday of the month with the Machados. I'd prepare all kinds of traditional Portuguese dishes alongside their house staff. And yeah, they had house staff. The Machados had a huge place on the outskirts of town. Had a proper gate and everything. Always felt like I was in a spy movie driving up there, having to check in at the guardhouse. The house itself wasn't that big in relation to the surrounding yard. It was 2 stories and had a vast wine cellar. It was the first thing Erica showed me on the house tour. It looked to be a refurbished, turn-of-the-century mansion, and you could tell it had seen better days, but I'll be damned if it wasn't impressive. Family photos lined the walls, along with pictures from various achievements. Signing a contract with the Hatchet Investment Group, meeting the president, sitting in at the Nobel Prize dinner, There were always shifting faces in the center of the picture, but you could always spot Octavia in the background. Didn't matter if it was Caesar or Christo standing in front of the camera, you could tell who was really pulling the strings. Autumn turned to winter. At the first snowfall, I got a call from Erica. "We have a business dinner coming up next week," she said. "We need something special." "All right, what do you need?" I said, scrambling to get a pen and paper. "We have very rare and precious meat coming in," she said. "I don't know the name. Something Portuguese. Can you read off the box? It would really help." "Mother wants it simple," she said. "Oven bake it, add a sauce. You can come by and inspect it." "You have it?" I asked. "Can you send me a picture?" So she did. I had no idea what I was looking at. It looked like the leg of a horse, but slightly smaller. It was completely black and skinless, and there were blotches of blue staining the freezer they'd put it in. In the place where one might expect a hoof, it instead had this mass of spaghetti-like frills. Running up the side of it, I spotted what looked like barnacle mounds. That was no fish, and it was no animal I'd ever cooked. I thought there was something wrong with the picture, like a lighting thing. I asked Erica to send me another, and she did. Same thing, other angle. What the actual fuck was it? The Machados were very busy, and I couldn't manage to drop by to see the meat for myself. Instead, I had to wait for the day of the cook. I had no idea what to bring, and after several texts from Erica, I resigned myself to just accept that I was going in blind. Driving up there, I noticed about a dozen cars in the driveway. Some people were standing outside, smoking, others were lounging in the nearby gazebo. All of them were dressed in combinations of black and grey. Men and women of all adult ages, all dressed up. The moment I stepped out of my car, Caesar was there to greet me. He shook my hand and led me inside, talking as we went. "The meat is for guests only," he said. "No taste testing." "Then how can I—" "No questions. No tasting. None. Understood?" I nodded as we squeezed past two men going out for a smoke. Caesar could be pushy, but this time he was outright demanding. This was clearly a big night for him. As we got to the kitchen, he handed me a pair of gloves. I didn't immediately put them on, but he gave me this cold stare until I did. "Those stay on," he said, "until you're done." "Sure thing." "So what rules are we up to?" "No tasting. The gloves stay on." "That's right." We rounded the kitchen island and went past the pantry. They had a small walk-in freezer, which Caesar had the keys to. He unlocked the door, went inside and waved me along. "If it is expensive, you shouldn't freeze it," I said. "I could have—" "It's not frozen," Caesar interrupted. "It doesn't freeze." The box was bigger than I'd anticipated. It was made of this green aluminum-reinforced plastic casing with some kind of icebox interior. The label clearly said "Carne Azul Gruta," which I believe can be translated to something like blue cave meat. Up close, it looked even more alien. There was a heat coming off of it, causing plumes of steam to rise from the box. It was clear that it was a limb of some kind, but I couldn't make heads or tails of it. Was the frills the foot or the hip? "Every portion should be fist-sized," Caesar continued. "Oven-baked. No longer than 40 minutes. Use whatever you see fit for garnish and side dishes. How am I supposed to work with it if I can't taste it?" "Look." Caesar put a hand on my shoulder and squeezed. He talked to me using his full hand, never letting up with the eye contact. "Not your concern," he said. "You bake it, you serve it. Make the best of it. Okay?" "Okay," I nodded. "Yeah, okay." And no tasting. As he left me alone with the box, a thought hit me. I brought out my phone and compared the images that Erica had sent me. It wasn't that the box was bigger. The meat was. Had it grown? Working with the house staff, I could tell they were anxious. There were close to 25 guests in total. Some Portuguese, some American, all ridiculously wealthy. The tires on their cars probably cost more than my apartment. But I did as I was told. I kept my gloves on, and I had the house staff help me unbox the meat. We laid it all out, and I started to cut it. I was surprised to learn just how soft it was. There was literally no bone. There was something resembling thick lines of cartilage, but it was on the outside of the meat. I could pull it off like a thick string with some effort, leaving something akin to fillets to be harvested. The meat was blue all the way through. It dripped these ink-like blots onto the floor that just didn't seem to scrub out. My elbow-high gloves had a lot to live up to. We prepped the meat in fist-sized portions alongside olive and tuna salad and corn-fried rice. As instructed, we oven-baked it for 40 minutes and garnished it with cilantro, oregano and dried garlic flakes. We plated it with fresh peas for garnish, alongside a house-special virgin olive oil. I have a hard time describing the smell. While raw, it had this strange tinge of ammonia, but when cooked, it was almost completely scentless. But even scentless, there was something about the heat coming off it that singed my nose. I almost sneezed all over one of the servings and had to excuse myself. Stepping out for a smoke, I saw something peculiar in the backyard. About a dozen men and women, all in their mid-50s, running and playing across the snow-covered yard like excited children. Some singing, some throwing snowballs. There were 2 grown women playing tag, screaming as they sprinted across the yard. I hardly noticed the man directly to my left. "Hey," he said. "You the chef?" A man in his early 60s, full black tie get-up, grey hair combed and oiled. I nodded at him, and without a hint of hesitation he flung his arms around me. "Thank you," he sniffled. "Thank you so much." It was time. As the aperitifs disappeared, the wine glasses were filled, and the plates of carne azul gruta made their way out to cheers and applause, but no one dared touch their plates. I remember standing by the door, waiting to be excused. Octavia rose from her chair as the room erupted with stomping feet. "Today I resign my post," she said. The sound was deafening. Screams and cheers all across the room. Grown men and women screaming like children. I saw a man in his early 70s at the end of one of the tables, crying his eyes out. We dined together. We enjoy the fruit of what is to come. We drown this cycle in joy. Together. Octavia raised her glass, and the others followed suit. They waited her final words with bated breath. "Io," she said, and throughout the room the same word bounced off the walls. It was sung, screamed, cried, and praised. An all-encompassing word for all ages and creeds, sung with an unnatural vigor. I could see their eyes widen as they grasped their utensils. Forks and knives ferociously cutting into the strange meat, stains of blue pouring out onto their plates. All to a single unifying chant. "Io, Io, Io." I had to step out. They were getting uncomfortably riled up. Some of them didn't even bother with knife and fork, just stuffing the meat into their faces. Some took their time, savoring it alongside the corn-fried rice. There was this one woman who cut the meat into thin slices, painstakingly wrapping each pea from the garnish in it and savoring it like it was her last meal on this earth. One of the house staffers pulled me aside with a whisper. "Don't look," she said. It'll get worse." "What the fuck is going on?" I whispered. "Stay quiet, take your money and go," she continued. "Don't make them like you." The rest of the night turned into something else entirely. The guests retreated to one of the lounges. At first it was just like any other party, drinks and music. Then things started to escalate. I saw a man in his early 30s passionately making out with a woman in her late 70s. There were a whole circle of women just taking turns screaming at and pushing each other. One man just sat by the window, reciting an entire book from memory. Then the lights were dimmed, and things got even worse. Some were getting undressed right then and there. Screams of passion, rage, fear, or just because. In the middle of the room, a group of older men arranged a circle and took turns beating the ever-living shit out of one another. There was this one man who took a hit to the temple and went down like a brick. He was spazzing out, like he'd gotten a brain hemorrhage of some kind. The others just laughed and kicked him. Even in the dim light, I could see him bleeding out on the expensive carpet. But the fucked up thing, he was laughing too. I retreated to the kitchen where the house staffers were finishing up the dishes. I was at a loss for words. I pointed back at the corridor leading to the lounge, but they just shrugged. "We should call someone," I yelled. "There's a man bleeding out on the goddamn carpet." "Go ahead," one of them said. "Call the police." I brought my phone up, dialed 911, and was about to hit the call button. I looked up, but there were no reactions. No one seemed to care. It gave me pause. "Why? Aren't you doing anything?" I asked. "Because there are no victims. Go on. Look again." I did, reluctantly. I went back into the lounge, which had devolved further. There was blood on the carpets and walls, and I could barely see where one body began and another stopped. I could feel hands tugging at me in the dark and hear the snapping of teeth. From somewhere behind me I could hear the unmistakable sound of fork and knife sliding against one another. That one word, repeated as a mantra. It was screamed, whispered, moaned, and cried. In unison. Yo. I felt like a sheep in a pit of lions. There were threats all around me, and making too much noise would draw their attention. This wasn't just a party. This was something wrong. I started to realize just how much danger I was really in. That feeling sunk into the bottom of my stomach like a stone, leaving my pulse to bounce back and forth up my spine. I didn't even think about looking for a victim or a dead body. I was leaving, and I was calling someone. Money be damned. But as I got to the door, I ran into someone I hadn't anticipated. Octavia. Just her. No one else. No chaperone. No daughters. Or grandsons. And for some reason, this did little to calm me. I firmly remembered Dado telling me, in no unclear words, that this woman was the devil. After seeing what I'd seen, I was inclined to agree. "Come," she said. "You get paid. You can leave. You can, just send it," I said. "Come," she insisted. "Don't worry." "No, I think I'll—" She turned to me, and behind those youthful green eyes, something moved, like a slight shift in her skull, dropping half of her face 1/2 inch, like a melting candle. She flashed me her blackened gums as she gritted through her teeth. "N-O-W." That wasn't the voice of an old woman, and she wasn't asking. I followed her to a private study, an intimate room with hardwood floors and musky furniture, decades of files and folders, all neatly organized in oak bookshelves. Octavia pointed at a slip of paper on a coffee table, next to a vase of dried blue sunflowers. "Take it." I did. It was my salary for the evening. As agreed upon, rounded up. Octavia picked up a small plate from her desk. "You're diligent," she said. "An eager servant. Traditional, but flexible." Something in her bones shifted with a crack. I could have sworn I saw her left arm grown an inch longer. "I want you to stay on for longer," she continued. For my daughter. I'm, honored, I said. But I am committed to my job. This is not a question of work. This is a question of worth. She handed me the plate where a single bite of carne azul gruta remained. I think you'll like it, she smiled. Everyone does. I'm good, thank you. Now, one bite won't hurt. No, thank you. Another audible snapping sound. This time there was no mistake. It was definitely something wrong with her. Her jaw unhinged like a snake, and one of her eyes rolled back in her skull. Something dark started to run out of her nose, and I could see her skin shrivel. It all went so fast that I barely had time to step back. She was still holding the plate out for me. I was about to run when I realized we weren't alone. At least 8 of her guests were standing in the doorway, bawling their eyes out. Not from sadness, but an unimaginable joy. No, 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 Octavia muttered. Ooh-oon. I could see every flap of her tongue as she tried to form the words, but the words didn't come. She pushed the plate against me, but I hindered every instinct in grabbing it. Instead, it dropped to the floor and shattered. There was a shriek. Some from the guests, some from Octavia. Her guests rushed into the room, pushing me aside. Some threw themselves on the floor, stuffing their faces with whatever drops of sauce they could find. Others headed straight for Octavia. They tore at her, ripping away clothes, revealing slouching flesh. Her fragile form laid bare, and they just attacked her, tearing at her hair and skin. With barely any effort, it all started to come off. The chants returned as they all descended on her like wild animals. Ew! I could see splotches of blue, not red, as they tore her open. It wasn't like butchering an animal. It was like a snake shedding its skin. Ew! I heard snapping joints and crackling bones as she grew in stature. From a measly 4'9", something birthed itself from her body. Something at least 9 feet tall, slouching to even fit in the room. Ew! Oil slick and black and blue, what remained of Octavia couldn't form words. But it didn't need to. The stench was so strong that I must have gotten a contact high. There were these flashes where I saw myself as if in different worlds. One where I was just a pile of black ooze, barely even resembling a human. Another where I was covered in teeth. One where I was burning in an endless hellscape, screaming from exposed nerve endings. And through it all, in every existence and every living nightmare, that chant persisted. I snapped out of it. A single drop of blue had spattered on my cheek. I wiped it off, trying to catch my breath. Octavia, or what remained, was distracted by the pile of guests. I ran. I got to the door when I heard something stumbling behind me. Looking back, I glanced at this massive humanoid clumsily making its way out of the study, throwing guests like paper dolls as it chased after me. It had barely learned to walk, but it already knew that it wanted to chase, to attack. I saw its featureless face, looking more like a strange growth than a head. I made my way down the stairs. I hadn't even realized I was screaming, but the screams just blended in with the rest. For a moment, I sounded like one of them, just another guest. It didn't even try to get down the stairs. It flung itself forward. It haphazardly tumbled down, almost bowling me over as it crashed against the wall. I had to choose, front door or kitchen. I chose the kitchen. I could see them lining the rooms, naked guests, smeared with blue handprints, bruises and blood, some with grievous wounds which seemed to close as little blue frills sewed them shut from the inside. As soon as Octavia revealed herself, there were cheers and praises coming from them. I ran screaming down the hall to the sound of applause. There was no one coming to help. I made my way through the kitchen, throwing myself past the kitchen island. There were 3 house staffers there who didn't seem to understand what was going on. The moment Octavia stepped through the door, everything changed. They turned to run, to keep up with me. This was not part of their plan. This was far beyond the paycheck or anything else. Decadence was one thing, but this? No. I didn't stop to look, but I heard bones break, joints snap. I heard one scream cut off as something heavy was thrown across the room. Reaching the backyard, I just kept running. Looking back one final time, I could see Octavia being swarmed by her guests. They held her back, hugged her, kissed her, and caressed her, like a swarm of maggots piling on a wound. The last thing I saw of her, of that mansion, was that 9-foot-tall monstrosity standing tall, swarmed by insignificant maggot people. It did not care for them. It wanted to hunt. I made my way to the end of the estate and managed to climb the fence. I just kept going, crying my way all the way to the highway somewhere around 3 a.m. I almost wandered into oncoming traffic, only to be picked up by a newspaper van. So, yeah. I called the police. Turns out the family had called ahead about this being a wake for their late grandmother. For all intents and purposes, it seems like the world had already registered Octavia Machado as being deceased. I tried to skirt around the insane details of that night, instead focusing on the missing house staffers. But since they were there illegally, and not being paid on the record, there was little to no enthusiasm in investigating it further. I tried. I really, really tried. But after having Christo and Cesar making a house visit, and making it known in no small terms that they'd destroy my life if I even looked at a police car, I had little choice but to stay quiet. The fuckers even reminded me to cash my check. The family moved earlier this year, which is why I can finally share this with the world. I've moved since as well, and they won't find me anytime soon. I just want you to be aware of the kind of people you're dealing with. There's another level to their depravity, and I don't know how to live with it. I don't know what to make of it. I don't know, and I don't want to know. If there is anything that can be said that would make this feel normal, I don't want anything to do with it. If you remember anything from this, anything at all, I hope it is this: don't eat the blue meat. When Sammy got sick, it was like stepping into a dark mirror world. We'd been economically well off with our 2 full-time jobs and child-free lifestyle, so to suddenly step down to a single income was a wake-up call. Not to mention how the insurance companies managed to weasel out of paying for more than half of Sammy's treatment. Disgusting. Sammy swung for the fences. She took it all in stride. We had our ups and downs with every doctor's visit, but we always ended taking steps back rather than forward. There was always next time. They said, but we figured we were quickly running out of next times. 1 year down the line, Sammy was on a downward spiral. By then, the catastrophic had turned tragically mundane. I did everything I could to keep her spirit up, but at that point, her light was faded. We barely spoke anymore. A work friend of mine, Barry, was having a bachelor party. He was pulling out all the stops. I was never planning on going, but Sammy insisted I should. You need to get out of the house for a bit, she smiled. Do something normal for a while. I protested, but seeing her light up for the first time in weeks was enough to break my guard. She was so happy to see I still had friends out there. How could I say no? I agreed to be the designated driver. I wouldn't be gone for more than a day, and I'd just be a phone call away. Sammy didn't seem to need that kind of reassurance. It was mostly for me. This was in November. Barry was having a December wedding and wanted all his pals to come along for one big night. Sure, I was just a work friend. But when you're in your mid-30s, you gotta take what you get, friends-wise. And Barry certainly took what he could, inviting no less than 25 people. So, in mid-November, I packed my bags and stepped on board a party bus heading for Annapolis. There were drinks and dinner at the hotel, then a few hours of losing money on the craps table. I gambled away about $200 at the roulette table, but magically won about $600 playing blackjack, after months of losing battle after battle. It felt good to finally win. I gotta admit, I was getting into it. Not as much as Barry's best man Jake, the guy wearing goggles who spelled out boobs. But hey, that's hard to top. What a legend. Once it became apparent that there'd be no need for a designated driver, I just went along with it. 5 shots of mint schnapps later, and I started feeling a bit guilty. I called Sammy, but she laughed it off. "It's good to hear you slur," she said. "You're a fun drunk." Most of the night went by in a blur. More drinks, some dancing, lots of cheering for our main man Barry. Flashing lights, people pulling us back and forth between dance floors, bars, and wandering the streets looking for a taco truck. I clearly remember sitting on a park bench at one point, listening to one of Barry's friends lecture me about roasted seed snacks, something about antioxidants and digestion. I only remember the noise of it. I ended up back at the hotel. Jake had rented Barry this huge room, and 12 of us had made it all the way there. The after party, and the night was far from over. Because, of course, there had to be exotic dancers. I crossed a line by getting completely bass-ackwards drunk, but that's about as far as I was willing to go. I gently but firmly declined to partake in any dancing. Instead, I retreated to the back of the room and enjoyed a cigar. Not a habit I'm very proud of, but it's one of those things my old man taught me to appreciate. A good cigar, a whiskey on the rocks. Hell, a man might forget his troubles for a while. Sometime after them replaying Pour Some Sugar on Me for the 6th time, the party was dying down. Some people were heading back to their rooms. Some did so with the company of a dancer. It was a wild night. But like most parties, the music dies. And at 3 in the morning I was ready to let it. There were only 4 of us left by then. Barry, Jake, some guy named Ramsey, and I. We'd all crashed on a couch, telling stories about our wives. Or in Barry's case, his wife-to-be. It was a wild party, but it was clear the guy was in love. Gotta respect that. Then a stranger walked in. At least 6'7", body like a scarecrow. Wore all black, except for a white shirt. White hair slicked back and combed. He had the most intense blue eyes I'd ever seen, like he could look straight through me if he wanted. "I see you gentlemen are enjoying yourselves," he smiled. "I'm guessing the girls didn't disappoint." "They most assuredly did not," hiccuped Jake. "But we're married men here." "Oh, I can tell. If it wasn't for the cigars, all I'd smell in here is virtue." That got a chuckle out of us. Jake introduced him as Tom, or Stranger Tom. Apparently, he was the kind of guy you'd talk to if you wanted to have a good time anywhere from Pasadena to Kent Island. He co-ran several clubs, and he was an enthusiastic movie entrepreneur. I only had to see the color of his business cards to know exactly what kind of movies he made. Classy stuff. As we started winding down, our discussion drifted into a more philosophical nature. Barry kept saying how much he hoped this marriage would be the one. Jake was worrying about his youngest kid not making it through college. Ramsey was on the verge of crying, talking about his sick dog. And me? Well, I didn't want to say anything. I didn't want to think about real life for a while. Stranger Tom took his feet off the coffee table, spilling an ashtray on the floor. He brought out this intricate silver lighter, engraved with a crow and a pair of sunflowers. "Let's imagine, if you would, that you could get answers to all those questions," he said. "If you could know what things would look like with your wife 20 years down the line, if you could get a hint how to push your boy to the finish line, or how you could find just the right person to help your darling pooch make it just a little longer." "Yeah?" grinned Barry, finishing the last drops of his drink. "That'd be worth something, wouldn't it?" "Sure would," nodded Jake. "Well, how about it then?" Tom flicked open his lighter, and this steady blue flame shot out, small but bright as hell. It didn't flicker. "It'll cost you, but you'll get what you want. Price varies on the scope of the question." "Is this like a party trick? Like a Luigi board?" chuckled Jake. The guys laughed. I couldn't hold back a snort myself. "Ouija board," Ramsey corrected. "Luigi is the, Mario guy." "Whatever. Tom, is it like that?" "Nah," Stranger Tom smiled. "I assure you, it ain't nothing like that." He turned his attention to me, eyeing me up and down. There was this strange smile on his face, and the man never seemed to blink. Even then, as drunk as I was, I could tell he was creepy as shit. "I'm good," I smiled. "You guys go ahead. Surely you want to know something? Something good?" I looked down at my empty glass. Tom was getting on my nerves. Playing on the worries of drunk people is one of the lowest ways to trick someone out of a cheap buck. Reminded me of a televangelist, but without the promise of paradise. "Sure," I nodded. "I'm calling you out, Tom. I want you to tell me the color of my lucky boxers, the ones I wore at my wedding." "That's it?" "That's it." "Fair enough," said Tom. "Now take a good hard look and just tell me one thing." We all focused on the silver lighter with the little blue flame, unflickering, steady, like an oil picture. "Do you submit?" he asked. We did. It all happened in an instant. This one loud snap, like a choir of carrots breaking in unison. Jake's right arm fragmented in 3 places. I could see bone poking out in different directions, breaking through the skin. Ramsey's jaw snapped, and 3 teeth rolled out of his mouth, tapping against the side of the table as they tumbled across the floor. Barry's left leg seemingly exploded, cracking wide open from ankle to hip. And me, a sting on my index finger. Nothing more. For a second there were no screams, just these blank stares as we were drawn into the blue light. There was no panic, no agony, just realization. "Yes," said Jake in perfect clarity. "Yes, that's how." "She's still beautiful," muttered Barry. Ramsey tried to talk but ended up slurring with his broken jaw. Blood-mixed spit poured out of the corner of his mouth, along with 2 more teeth. I sat there, looking at these 3 broken men as Stranger Tom lit a cigarette. It was like 3 puppets who'd had their strings cut, talking out loud like wind-up dolls. Tom held the lighter aloft, keeping the blue flame bright and steady. He looked me dead in the eye, his smile growing wider. "They were red," he said, "with little white petals." He closed the lighter, and our collective consciousness went out, along with the blue flame. Waking from a dreamless sleep, I remember screaming. It stank of blood, and I could see dark brown spots across the floor and furniture. There were 2 EMTs giving Barry chest compressions, and someone lifting Jake out of his chair. Ramsey was nowhere to be seen. It was bright outside. Someone was trying to get me out of my chair. "Make room!" they yelled. "Get out! Is he dead? Oh my God, is he dead?" I leaned against an unknown hotel staffer as she helped me out of the room. The second I was out, the hangover and shock buckled me over. I hurled all over the carpet. The hallways were covered in confused guests as a flurry of people rushed past me. I only caught a glimpse of Barry's arm. It was white as snow. I had nothing but a bruise on my index finger. It was chaos. EMTs running back and forth. Screams in the hallway, in the rooms. Someone just kept yelling, "What's wrong with Barry?" over and over again. My heart was beating so fast that I could barely hear it. Stranger Tom had been absolutely right. My lucky boxers were red with white petals. I got them for my wedding day, and they always managed to bring Sammy a smile. They were just this bright reminder of happier days. So, of course, they were lucky. But I couldn't stop staring at my index finger. I'd asked a small question and paid a small price. Was it that simple? Was it real? Really real. Barry's fiancée promised to inform us as soon as she heard something about his condition. One of the other guests offered me a ride home. One by one, we left the town in silence. All the while, I couldn't stop thinking about that tall man with the silver lighter. By the time I got home, Sammy had already heard the news. She hobbled all the way to the front door, almost dropping her cane as she flung herself at me. I wrapped my arms around her, feeling a tinge of ache in my finger. "Thank God you're okay," she sobbed. "They said it was an accident." I didn't want to worry her. She had so much on her mind as it was. "I don't know, honey," I lied, kissing her head. I was out cold. The next few weeks I got a lot of updates. Barry had started to recover. Jake was so messed up they had to amputate parts of his lower arm, along with 2 fingers. Ramsey had to drink his dinner for the foreseeable future, but he was doing better. I tried to put it all out of my head. I had more immediate things to deal with, even if that blue flame haunted my nightmares. I sometimes imagined Stranger Tom sitting at the edge of my bed, asking me if there was anything I liked to know. And of course there was, but this was madness. There's no such thing as wandering prophets and soothsayers. But when I saw an Instagram post of Ramsey hugging his dog, something ached in my heart. Maybe it was all real. Maybe I'd missed a real, actual opportunity. In early December, Sammy took a turn for the worse. Her parents were over every day to help out while I was at work, trying their best to get her to her various appointments. The doctors had all but given up, but were determined to finish the treatment nonetheless. Then came that one day. I'd forgotten about doing laundry and only had a single pair of underwear left. My lucky boxers, red with white petals. Putting them on, even then, brought a smile to Sammy's face. I decided that I wouldn't let the mundane win. I wouldn't wait for the worst to happen. I took time off work and went to see Jake. Jake was still on sick leave for his broken arm. I met him at a cafe downtown, and we got ourselves a couple of bear claws. Without the boobs glasses, he almost looked like a person. We small-talked about Barry and Ramsey and how they were doing better. Jake talked about his arm and how the 2 of us had lived through the wildest nights of our lives. Then he took a long look at me. "You really do have red boxers with white petals, don't you?" he asked. "I got a pair, yeah." He nodded, taking another sip of his steaming hot coffee. He looked out the window with a sigh. "My boy is doing better," he said. "Turns out he's got an eye condition. Gave him migraines. So he's doing better?" "Night and day," Jake smiled. "It's nothing short of a miracle." There was a pregnant pause as we just nodded at one another, drinking our coffee. Finally, I bit the bullet. "Jake, I'm gonna need the number to Stranger Tom." Jake tried to help as best as he could, but it turns out it wasn't quite that simple. He'd met Tom through a friend of a friend of a friend. Backtracking wasn't as easy as it seemed. Jake gave me the number to a guy who worked at the casino we'd been to. That guy, in turn, directed me to a nightclub manager up in Halthorpe. It took me 2 days of emailing, texting, messaging, and unwanted calls to finally get to a clear lead. A dancer over in Ferndale told me she could set up a meeting with him for a price. It cost me all my blackjack winnings, but I finally had a time and address. Some guy who'd won the lottery had rented out a strip joint. Guess who their host was? It was a Friday night when I drove out there. The place was rented out and closed to the public. I slipped the bouncer a $100 bill, name-dropped the dancer I'd talked to, and promised I wouldn't cause any trouble. That did the trick. The party was going strong. Explosive music, dim red lights, smoke, champagne and sweat. Clinking bottles accompanied by cheers and groans. Not too different from a certain bachelor party. I could almost feel the champagne bubbles tickle my nose. And there, at the bar, sat none other than Stranger Tom. Walking up to him, I felt my heart sink into my stomach. This might be one big Hail Mary, or I could be the dumbest man on the entire East Coast. Tom turned in his seat, sliding a shot of whiskey my way. He didn't even look up. "I knew you'd be back," he said, throwing me a side-eye. "You have questions?" "Just one." "It'll have to wait." He smiled. "I got business." He turned to face the partygoers. He raised a glass to them, getting a handful of cheers in return. Tom spoke under his breath, never dropping that unnerving smile. "Fucking clown monkeys." As he turned, those piercing eyes dug deep into me. They seemed different now, stronger, angrier. I could have sworn they moved, like fire. "I don't usually let people ask me twice," he said. "Then again, most don't want to." "It's important," I said. "And I'll pay the price." "Oh, I'm well aware. You come chasing me down, you gotta be hella desperate. Drink your whiskey." "I'm good." I wasn't asking. My heart skipped a beat. I chugged it, letting the liquid fire sink into my throat. My fingers tingled, and I could imagine the ache of my index finger. Just that tinge of pain with promises of more to come. Stranger Tom turned to face the bartender, ordering himself another shot of whiskey. "Who are you?" I asked. "How do you do what you do?" "I'm no one," Tom said. "Who cares?" "So you won't tell me?" He held up his glass, letting the liquid reflect off of the colored lights. Suddenly, his silver lighter was on the table. I never saw him reach for it. It just sort of appeared. "I come from a land of a watchful red sun," Stranger Tom grinned. "Where the snow is feathers and the shores are silver black. Where all the flowers have choked to death, turning a sickly blue." He tapped his lighter. "Like my fire." While Tom slipped from table to table, refilling glasses and lighting cigarettes, I stayed at the bar. After a while, it all looked the same. Men, women, dancing, sitting. It was all just meat, sweat, and fabric. Wedding rings reflecting the burst from a strobe light. Memorial tattoos grinding against exposed chests. My phone buzzed, and I knew it was Sammy. I couldn't bring myself to read it. Long past midnight, I'd fallen asleep at the bar. I woke up as one of the girls wished the bartender a good night. Looking up, I saw Tom waving me over. Most of the place had cleared out. Just a handful of guys left. Tom had the seat of honor at the edge of the table. There were traces of questionable powders right next to puddles of spilled mojitos. "You think there was ever life on Mars?" someone asked. "That's fucked up, right? Like, if there was." "Yeah," another agreed. "Like, all the way over there. What is that even like? What does it mean? For us?" Stranger Tom gave me a knowing look. "Sounds like you gentlemen are a curious lot." He smiled. "Now, let me present a hypothetical." He gave them the same speech as we'd gotten. Made it sound fun, kind of like a drinking game. Our biggest, deepest questions, all for a spooky little price. A deal with the strip club devil. One guy just asked for the name of whoever stole his pickup. Another tried to be a smartass, asking for the article number of a replacement drip pan for his fridge. They took turns asking these inane, childish nonsense questions, and I just sat there sweating. Then there is this one guy, this one drunk asshole that chimes in. "I want to know what God looks like," he grins. "Wouldn't you guys like to know?" "That's a big question," nodded Stranger Tom. "One of the biggest." "Yeah, well, I want to know," the guy repeated. "Don't you guys want to know?" They did. They all did. I tried to chime in, a word here and there asking them to reconsider or go back to their earlier questions. Hell, I even tried to suggest calling it a night. But it was too late, and Tom had already brought out his lighter. His eyes were brighter now, hungrier. He was thriving. I wanted to do something more, something drastic. If asking what a marriage looks like 20 years into the future rips your entire leg open, what does asking for the face of God cost? I made a plan in my head. I was going to head for the bathroom, maybe pull the fire alarm, or maybe get everyone a round of drinks, stalling for time. But when I saw Stranger Tom's grinning face looking down on me, I knew it was too late. "Don't you want to ask a question too?" he asked. I swallowed my pride, feeling the salt stick to the side of my throat. It burned worse than the whiskey. I nodded. "I want to know how to save my wife." I got a few strange looks from around the table, but Tom just smiled. "That's a big ask," he grinned. "A real big ask. Can you say help?" "Oh, I can," he nodded. "And I'm sure Sammy will be just fine." Looking back at it, I was just too nervous to notice, but I never told him her name. He flicked open his lighter and lit the blue flame. It felt like the bulbs in the room started to dim, like the music faded away. The static buzzing in the overhead speakers grew louder. "Then look deep into the flame, gentlemen. Look deep and answer me this." His eyes flickered. The flame didn't. "Do you submit?" And they did. I closed my eyes and held my breath, waiting for the pain to come. Seconds passed. Then a whisper. I love this part. The man across from me unfurled. That's the best word for it. Unfurled. From his fingertips and up, the very bones of his body started to come undone, like they were escaping his flesh, turning themselves into needles, puncturing him from the inside out. As his skull fractured, twisting his musculature into a parody of a human smile, he started barking nonsensical words, something from a dead language, long since unheard, all with perfect clarity and pronunciation, as his bones broke apart, smattering like a box of firecrackers. Whatever he saw was enough to drive him to an eldritch madness in that last moment, to view the face of a god. "Ayo," he smiled. "Ayo, ayo, ayo." Blood and tears streamed down his face. His neck broke in a snap, along with his spine and hip, twisting his body into an impossible shape. The others panicked. One guy fell backwards, out of his chair, as his body split open on the floor. Another headed for the emergency exit but didn't even get halfway, before his legs burst like popcorn. "Ew, ew, ew." They screamed with the last of their wit. One of them crinkled in on himself, like crushing a sheet of paper. One had his ribcage split open, folding him inside out like an empty pocket. "Yo, yo, yo!" It wasn't a yelp of pain. It was ecstasy. Stranger Tom stood up, soaking it all in. Without turning his eyes from the chanting mounds of broken men, he spoke out loud. "Yours will be worse," he said. "They wanted to see something. You want to save a human life. You know what that's worth?" He towered over me, his eyes literally crackling with a blue flame. "To preserve the infinite potential of a life, the immortal form, created in the image of those who begun?" He laughed. He laughed like it was the best joke he'd ever heard. He laughed until there were tears streaming down his cheeks. "You're going to suffer so many times over." He held up his lighter and put his finger on the lid. "Thank you," he smiled. Click. Images rushed past me, a beach of silvery black, white feathers falling from a clear sky, an endless, waveless ocean, and above, a bloodful, lidless eye, ever peering into the cracks of our being. Bending the world, growing larger in my mind, sucking me into a thoughtless everything. Ew, ew, ew. And at the end of a breath, the answer was clear to me. I'd had the cure all along. A few weeks down the line, Sammy was going to make a miraculous recovery. After 100 steps backwards, she was finally taking a step forward. It was bound to happen. It was always going to happen. Her hair and smile would grow back, and by spring she'd be sitting next to me feeding ducks at the pond. And now I was going to die. For nothing. I came to, being held aloft by stranger Tom. He panted like a hungry dog, his eyes fully blackened, with blue embers flickering impossibly deep in his skull. His teeth had grown sharp and predatory, revealing a white maggot-like tongue. He snickered with anticipation, staring into me. No, I stammered. "No, It's not." The last chance of Eo had died, reduced to a single wheezing cough from the final man with something that could resemble a face. "Stranger." Tom's smile faded. He turned his head to one side, frowning. You're not saving her, are you?" No. She's going to make it. On her own. God fucking damn it. He grasped my neck with one hand and threw me to the floor. I tried to fight him off, but it was like pushing on an oak. "I was looking forward to that one. I'm aching for it," he groaned. "And I get nothing? Just let—" "No," he spat. "I'm not getting much, but I'm gonna savor this." He let me go and stepped back. 100 thoughts rushed through my head. Pleading, cursing, crying, screaming. It all just turned into this whining noise, meaning nothing, and everything at once. Tom bore down on me, furious. "Give me what you fucking ow!" Then, a crack, and darkness. People tell me the place went up in flames. I think he set the fire, possibly to cover the tracks. It was easy enough to blame the partygoers. They didn't particularly care for fire safety. I remember swirling smoke moving overhead, as someone dragged me by the legs, and in that moment, that infinite second between life and death, I could see it, that big red eye in the sky, peering down at us, infinitely far away and enveloping us at the same time. Yo. For those who ask, I was just going to a party I'd been invited to. That's the official story. There was a fire, and a beam fell, gave me a minor spinal fracture and knocked me out cold. Few know that the fracture came long before the fire. The most magical irony of this whole story was just a few months ago. I was in bed, waiting for the pain meds to kick in, and Sammy was waiting for me by the door. "Can't sleep all day," she smiled. "We got ducks to feed." I wanted to share this in the faint hope that it prevents a tragedy to someone. Somewhere. He's still out there, lurking at the edge of parties, listening in on drunken songs, waiting for his time to strike, when that lapse of judgment is just right. It really makes sense for the most basic of advice to help us, even now, to never, ever talk to strangers. A few summers ago, my then girlfriend Taylor was taking a photography class at the local community college. She was looking to turn it into a sort of business, mostly wedding and school events. If everything worked out, she'd be looking at a side gig in a couple of weeks for the local high school, prom night. But first, she needed a whole bunch of reference photos. Sure, she had portraits and such, but little to no environmental shots. So, with a few friends and other photography enthusiasts, we set out to do a little urban exploring to find something neat for a shoot. Taylor had a few suggestions. Now, when I say urban exploring, you gotta consider that we live in this shitty little Minnesota town in the middle of nowhere. Urban exploring for us is finding an abandoned barn, or some kind of summer house that no one's been in for a couple generations. So a whole bunch of us set out, making a bit of a road trip out of it. There was me, of course, and my significant other, Taylor. There was Avi, a guy from her photography class. Finally, there was Leslie, in the same way that Taylor was looking to make a side career out of her photography. Leslie was looking to make some extra cash on her modeling. We all squeezed into my Nissan and took the roads less traveled, looking for any and all interesting locations. We stopped at a few places along the road. There was an old barn, but the place had been cleaned out to the point where you couldn't really tell what it was supposed to be. The missing planks in the wall made for some interesting lighting, though. I was on setup duty, meaning I carried around the heavy equipment borrowed from the class: a lighting screen, an external flash, timers, spare batteries, a laptop, the stuff that was awkward to carry. We got a few good shots, and most of us were ready to call it a day. It was Taylor's suggestion that we take the scenic route back just in case we spotted something fun. The sun was setting, but with the equipment we had, we could probably get some cool, high-contrast night photos for Leslie's Instagram. Going down several overgrown dirt roads, we ended up at what looked like an old house. One of those cheap prefabs from the 70s, the kind with paper-thin walls and roof tiles that blew off at the slightest touch of wind. The fake wooden wall panels really were the cherry on top. We got out, looking the place over. Taylor turned to us, talking like a game show host. "I'm betting there's at least one tacky thrift store painting in there," she laughed. $10. Any takers?" "No," said Avi, shaking his head. "I like my money." Leslie was already looking for interesting props to be photographed with. I was too busy getting the equipment out. Taylor didn't have to look for long before she found what she was looking for, a cheap little thrift store painting hung in the middle of the living room. She spent some time in there, turning that painting over, looking to see if it was worth something besides the frame. She loudly proclaimed it to be hers, and that it was not to be touched. I took a walk down the side of the house, checking out the backyard. There was an overgrown flower bed, a destroyed tool shed, and plenty of rusted-out tools and spare metal pipes. You could tell whoever had lived there had been looking to make something of the place, but the abandoned scaffolding told another story. There were the remnants of an old garden, along with a little chicken coop. Then there was a well, and that caught my attention. It wasn't just any well. It was much older than the rest of the property. The ground around it was littered in dead sunflowers and blue petals, seemingly untouched by nature. The layer of dirt was so old that I genuinely couldn't picture the original color of the stonework. The well itself was some old-school kind of masonry. sturdy enough to last another century or so. There was also a little roof over it, and the pièce de résistance, a bell. This thing was completely black. I thought it was from grime and dirt at first, but running my finger across it, I realized it was clean as a whistle. The black was just that, color. I'd never seen that kind of metal before. It was much lighter than the usual bronze. I called the others over. As soon as they saw it, I could see the smiles creeping across their faces. This thing was something special, something to be photographed. "Yeah, we're shooting it," said Taylor. "Les, I'm going to need you on the side there. You good to sit?" "Gotta wash this stuff anyway," she sighed. "We're done after this though, right?" Yeah, nodded Taylor. "Babe, you got the reflector?" "Got it," I nodded. "You're going 2-point or 3-point?" "Let's start with 1-point," said Taylor, tuning the settings on her camera. "Let's make it intense, yeah?" As she twisted and turned the various dials, Avi was setting up a setup of his own. His camera was much nicer, but he didn't have all the peripheral equipment. Then again, neither did we, really. It was all borrowed. Leslie sat on the edge of the well, looking down. She sighed, thinking out loud. "This thing is deep," she said. "Real deep." "It's a well," chuckled Avi. "It's supposed to be." "No, but never mind." As Leslie turned her attention back to Avi and his camera, Taylor's curiosity got the better of her. She pulled the rope on the bell. I expected a faint, dirt-covered clang, but there was absolutely nothing, not the slightest vibration. No one seemed to notice. It wasn't even dulled, it just had no sound at all. I poked my ear a little, just to make sure I wasn't missing something. Neither Taylor nor Leslie seemed too bothered by it. Avi, on the other hand, grimaced. "Would you cut that out?" he asked. "Damn." "Cut what out?" asked Taylor. "The bell. Give it a rest." Taylor looked at him with a genuine curiosity. Then she turned to me. I just shrugged. She stopped playing with the bell as I finished my setup. We spent some time just trying out a couple settings and having Leslie pose for a bit. Despite us having explicitly asked Leslie to come along for this ride, I could tell there was some tension between her and Taylor. I'd definitely be hearing about it later that night. As the sun set and we finished our shoot, Avi started packing things back into the car. I stayed behind to check out the photos with Taylor, giving some feedback on her ideas and helping her pick out some favorites. Leslie added some opinions to the mix as well, but she mostly just wanted to showcase the pictures who showed the most leg. She was really proud of those legs. While Taylor and Leslie got into an argument about focus length, I decided to move the laptop and some of the remaining equipment back to the car. I could hear them all the way from the backyard, using that "we're fighting but not really fighting" kind of voices. The ones where they're quick to tell each other how much they value their opinions, while simultaneously disregarding them. Avi was being curiously quiet, though. Rounding the corner, it became apparent why. He was gone. The car just stood there, doors wide open. All the equipment was loaded in, but it was as if he'd left in a hurry. Looking around, where was no obvious trail left behind. The road out of there was straight and clear. If he'd gone down it, I would have seen him. It was strange, to say the least. Trying to rationalize it, I figured he might have gone to take a piss. But as the minutes started to rack up, it was getting clearer and clearer that he wasn't around anymore. He'd gone somewhere, suddenly, much like the original owner of the property. Then I realized something. He had the car keys. Coming back to the others, I couldn't help but to feel the tension brewing in the air. "We ready?" Leslie asked. "I think we're done here." "I can't find Avi," I said. He's not by the car. One sec. Taylor picked up her phone and gave Avi a call. It went straight to voicemail. She turned to me, shaking her head. Let's give him a minute, she said. Let's check out the house. We did as she asked, taking a stroll within the mildew-infested house. Moth-eaten drapes, hanging on for dear life, barely covering the broken windows. Raw wooden floors that buckled a little more than I was comfortable with. A couch, missing 3 legs and all but 1 cushion, right next to the broken frame of a love seat. A single thrift store painting clung to the wall, picturing what looked like a wooden bucket of discolored sunflowers. So how long are we waiting before we just go? Asked Leslie. If he wanted a ride, he shouldn't have wandered off. He has the keys, I added. What? He was packing the car, I explained. So he has the keys. Fuck it, Leslie sighed. I'm calling an Uber. She couldn't get the GPS function to work, so we were having difficulties giving directions. Furthermore, reception was just terrible. Calls would go through, but they kept dropping randomly. It's as if the bars swung back and forth between perfect and barely available. As the minutes passed into an hour, with no sign or response from Avi, we were turning from annoyed to concerned. Without any kind of light, and as far from the city as we were, it was starting to get pitch black. Even using our phones, we could barely illuminate a couple of feet ahead of us. The darkness was oppressive. We patrolled along the edge of the forest, calling out for Avi. It was close to midnight when we made our way back to the house. We were tired, worried, and more than a little exhausted. Leslie was freezing. She hadn't exactly dressed for a long outing. I can't get a call through, said Taylor. Should we just walk? I only got 15% battery, said Leslie. I don't want to move in the dark. So none of you can get a hold of someone? I asked. My texts just turned red. Can't be sent. They both shook their heads. I'd seen them staring face down at their phones for the past 2 hours, and we were still nowhere closer to getting a call through. Also, no wonder we were running low on batteries. As Taylor gave Avi one last call, we waited patiently. Except this time, I heard something. It was faint, but definite. I held up my hand, signaling for the other 2 to stop and listen. It was coming from outside. By now, it was too dark to see. I could hear a phone ringing out there, but I couldn't see where it came from. Leslie anxiously paced back and forth, as if wondering why we weren't going out there to talk to him. But we could all tell there was just something off. Even in the dark, at this distance, I could tell something was out there. The sound from the phone seemed to move irregularly. It was slightly muffled, as if covered in something. Even Leslie seemed to notice it. Then, the sound sunk. It fell from a sudden height. We heard a splash from the well as the call disconnected. The 3 of us just stood there, dumbfounded. Taylor crept up close to me, whispering, Did he just throw his goddamn phone into the well? Somebody did, I responded. It wasn't a conscious thought, but it was the first thing that came to mind. Avi wouldn't just throw stuff away for no reason. We had to get a closer look. I volunteered to go check, but Taylor wouldn't let me go alone. Using Taylor's phone as a flashlight, it had the most remaining battery. The 2 of us were to move forward in unison. We were going to be really careful and slowly retreat back to the house at the first sign of trouble. Making our way out through the back door, we slowly stepped through the overgrown grass. There was a slight crunching noise, as if the grass was covered in frost, peculiar given the season. Taylor squeezed my arm, her head flicking about as she looked for threats in the dark. We got to the edge of the well, where we stopped to listen. There was nothing out there. No birds, no insects, nothing. No ambient light from the city, no idle chatter, no background noise. As someone who was used to sleeping with a TV show running in the background, the emptiness was palpable. I leaned over the edge, shining a light into the well. There was some sort of jacket at the bottom, but it was difficult to tell the color. The water was covered in algae, so it just looked like random fabric. Then there was a reflection, a very expensive camera lens. I stepped back, shaking my head. Taylor was playing with the bell again, pulling the rope for good measure, as if to check that it still wasn't making any noise. She looked up at me expectantly. "I think his camera is down there," I whispered. "You're still not hearing this thing, are you?" I looked back at the bell, shaking my head. There were a few moments of quiet contemplation before she accepted this. "We going back," she whispered. "We going back." We hurried back to the house. It was so quiet outside that I started to fill the silence with imaginary noises. I could imagine little whispers and footsteps out in the dark, vague threats spun out of nothing. As we got back to the house, I could tell Leslie was upset. "Just go ahead and let everyone know we're here," she complained. "Keep ringing the damn dinner bell." This time, we didn't let it pass. It was too strange of a comment to just toss out of the left field. "I didn't hear anything," I said. "Same," added Taylor. "Well, I did," said Leslie. "So make of that what you will." "No, I mean, what does that actually mean?" We all looked out the kitchen window. Even now, in the dark, we could see the bell swaying gently from side to side, still caught in the breeze. And still, it didn't make a sound. We discussed this in hushed voices. Taylor and I had both picked up on Avi hearing the bell shortly before disappearing, but Leslie wouldn't consider it. She tried to play it off as her simply not believing it, but I could tell she was scared. I think she was just trying to put on a brave face. A correlation between that sound and sudden disappearance was unnerving, to say the least. We must have talked for half an hour, going back and forth on our options. We thought about locking ourselves in the car and waiting for the sun to rise. But if there was really someone out there looking for us or stalking us, locking ourselves in plain sight wouldn't be the best option. So instead, we opted to stay inside, check our phones, and keep quiet. It was just past 1 a.m. We were sitting in what looked to be an old bedroom, but the bed frame had been stripped and leaned against the wall. There were grey spots on the floor where I guessed an old wardrobe or armoire had been standing for at least a couple of years. We settled for that room because the windows were still somewhat intact, and the drapes covered them completely. Still, the place smelled like a tetanus infection waiting to happen. "I can't believe you dragged me out here," Leslie muttered. "Excuse me, dragged you out here? What do you mean?" Taylor added. "I mean, as in without having someone in front of the camera. All you'll have are black and white photos of whatever," Leslie continued. "But now, you got art. Something sexy, you know." "It doesn't have to be sexy," Taylor frowned back. "It's for my portfolio." "Oh, so it was just for you all along. Am I getting that right?" The sarcasm was dripping, and I wasn't having it. I zoned out. I could hear something outside, but only barely. Leslie and Taylor were at each other's throats, making it close to impossible to hear anything over the vitriol. I tried shushing them, but Leslie refused to be shushed, and Taylor refused to lose the argument by forfeiting. I tried 2 more times, in vain, until a sound snapped us all out of it. A hand smacking against the window. We all stopped and looked up. I could see the silhouette of it, pressed against the window by the ambient light of the remaining phones. It didn't look right. The fingers were too long, too pointed. There was something off about the amount of fingers as well, but they were gone before I got the chance to count them. We all just sat there, counting our breaths. We were afraid to move, not wanting to provoke whatever was out there. Then we heard another thump, then another, from another window, and from the other room, breaking glass. A rattling door handle. There were footsteps going back and forth outside our window, hands sliding against the cheap outdoor panels. I turned my head back and forth so fast, my neck was having trouble keeping up. My pulse kept rising with every sound, my eyes desperately trying to find movement in the dark as our phones died. "Les, get to the bathroom," Taylor whispered. "There are frosted windows. They can't see you." "Why do I have to go?" she hissed back. "They're looking for you." Taylor groaned. "Please, Les, it's the safest place. We're not safe together." I could see little movements, heads turning my way. Honestly, I was too scared to concentrate. I just nodded. "Let's do it," I said. "It's safer." Leslie agreed. She moved at a snail's pace, and the moment the bathroom door shut, Taylor pushed herself against it, leaving Leslie stranded on the other side. At first, I didn't realize what was happening. Then I started hearing banging on the door. I tried saying something, but was immediately cut off. "What are you—" "I'm saving us," Taylor hissed. "Now help me with this goddamn door." There was a push from the other side, but Taylor held it close. Leslie was trying to get out, quietly knocking on the door. "There's no window," she cried from the other side of the door. It's wide open." At first it was pleading, begging, hammering on the door, offering up whatever bribe she could think of. But as the panic rose, she started to turn to threats. Leslie told us in explicit detail what she would do to us as soon as the door came down. And outside, I could hear something moving. Those things were coming her way. Shuffling footsteps, something scraping against the walls. The banging on the door grew more frantic. I joined Taylor in holding it shut as Leslie launched into a desperate rant. Then, out of nowhere, it stopped. Her silenced voice left a vacuum in the air as we heard something snap. Moments later, something was slowly dragged across the tiled bathroom floor. Taylor and I just sat there leaning against the bathroom door and one another. I couldn't believe we'd just done that, but I tried telling myself we didn't have a choice. The shuffling noises grew more distant. As my breathing slowed, Taylor whispered to me, "I think I might have seen the spare keys," she said, "when I was checking the glove box earlier. We ought to check." "You sure?" I asked. "Not even a little. But every car has spares, and I don't think I've seen you use yours. Maybe you forgot them in there." "Maybe," I agreed, furrowing my brow. Can we wait a bit?" "Sure," she nodded. "Let's wait a bit." We decided to give it a shot. We split up. I went to check the car for spares, while Taylor went to check what happened to Leslie. Those few minutes of sneaking into the car must have been some of the most stressful in my life. While nothing happened, it was so oppressively dark that I could barely see my own hands in front of me. I must have fumbled around for 10 minutes or so, but I couldn't find anything. Frustrated, I moved back towards the house, my hands still trembling. As soon as I got back in, I could sense that something was wrong. Taylor was nowhere to be seen, and I couldn't hear her. The door to the backyard was wide open. As I stumbled around in the dark, I accidentally knocked over the thrift store painting by the entrance. The clatter of the wooden frame startled me enough to knock the air out of my lungs. But looking down at it, I noticed something. There was text on the back of the frame. Ring the dinner bell 3 times. A great prize will be yours. I could barely make it out in the dark, but it was right there on the back. The same painting that Taylor had been checking out when she first entered the house. And as I read it, I heard something. This long, uncomfortable, droning sound. It was nothing like a bell ought to sound like. The vibrations were like something emerging from underwater, each pulse making my stomach churn, like milk turning sour. It was something vile, unusual. I could almost feel it running across my skin, like stale water. Disgusted, I made my way to the backyard door. I already knew what I'd see. Taylor had rung the bell a 3rd time. She'd rung it for Avi. She'd rung it for Leslie. And now she'd rung it for me. I could see the shape of her out there, in the dark. But there were many others. They were coming from the forests, from down the road, around the bend of the house. These vague, elongated humanoid shapes, like starved, stretched-out shadow men. It didn't take me long to realize I was surrounded. Now, my options were limited. Everything was telling me to run, but I had no idea where to. My mind was playing a loop of fight, flight, and freeze. I moved away of them, trying to get some distance. They were circling me. I kept turning, almost tripping over my own 2 feet. They were so quiet, ethereal. I ended up at the edge of the well, surrounded on all sides. Taylor had retreated into the dark crowd, who moved out of her way like a parting wave. I called out to her, but there was no response. Instead, this cloud of aggressors moved closer and closer. So with only one way left to go, I jumped into the well. I plunged into the ice-cold water. It was deeper than anticipated, breaking my fall. I could feel various cloth and debris, but it was hard to tell what was what in the dark. It wasn't until I caught hold of a shoe that I started to realize what was down there, especially when I realized there was still a foot inside. While the bodies themselves hadn't been dumped down there, it was clear that these were remains. Clothes, mostly, and little bits and pieces that hadn't been consumed. Leslie's piercings and shoes, Avi's clothes and gear. It was all there. Looking up, I saw these vague forms looking down on me. But that's where it stopped. They didn't climb down or move to pursue. Instead, they turned their attention elsewhere. The thought hit me that if this was where they stored waste, perhaps they had stopped considering me food. Maybe they refused to pick something out of the trash. But that meant they would go looking for it elsewhere. The bell had already been rung. With that realization, there was a loud scream. It was immediately cut short. I could hear bones breaking and clothes being torn. A careful slurping sound, like meat being pulled into a vacuum. The ripping of skin from limb. In mere minutes, more things started dropping down the well. Pieces of Taylor's clothes, fragments of bone and jewelry, and finally, the camera she'd borrowed. Then there was just shuffling. They kept moving around up there as if waiting for something or someone, but nothing came. I waited down there until the morning sun broke through. I was hypothermic, but very much alive. The inner walls of the well were actually rough enough for me to get my feet in the cracks. Fishing out the car keys from what I presumed was Avi's discarded trousers, I made a painstaking climb upwards. I must have been near a slip at least a dozen times, but I somehow kept making gains. And with considerable soul-drenching, exhausting effort, I rolled out of the well. I just lay there in the grass for a while, letting the shivers melt from my bones. As I did, I noticed something new. The birds were singing again. Chances are you never heard of any of this. It was mentioned at like The third page of a stateside newspaper. They called it some sort of death pact, claimed there was all kinds of evidence for it too. I can tell you for certain, there wasn't. Looking into it, I did find that Taylor had done some research on the place prior to taking us there. Apparently, the bell was rumored to only be heard by the next victim. And if you were to manage a successful third feeding, you'd get a gift that could rival the Yearwalker. Whatever that means. In hindsight, she was clever about it. Maybe she didn't know there was a loophole. Hell, neither did I. But I still feel like there's something from that day that is stuck within me. The memories, of course. That feeling of dread that I can wake up to at night. But there's also that bell, that chime. It is more than just a thing or a noise. It means something. And ever since I heard it, I know what being prey sounds like.